Welcome everyone. Thank you for attending this IAE webinar. I'm Pierre-Oliver Pineau. I'm a professor at HEC Montreal, which is a business school in Montreal, in Quebec. I'm very happy to share with you this webinar on Canadian energy in multiple crises. We have 20 minutes of webinars that I'll share with you, and then we'll have a question and answer period that you will, where we'll be able to interact. So, so I've shared my screen, and you should be able to see the my presentation. This webinar is really about the Canadian energy multiple crises that we have here in Canada, and I'll be presenting them in order. We have a few of them. Unfortunately, we have many crises. But first, before starting, we will before starting with the crisis, we'll basically have an overview of the Canadian energy sector, production and consumption. Canada is the 6th largest energy producer in the world, so we'll get into some of the details about the energy production in Canada and about the consumption level, which is also key to understand the context. And then we'll go into the series of crises that you see here. And then we'll try to figure out what could be sustainable path to go forward and try to move beyond these crises. So, so let's start with the production and consumption sector in Canada. Here you see the 10 largest energy producers in the world, from China to Brazil, all types of energy included. And so here we can see coal. We see China, that is the main coal producer in the world. Then and then you see the other ones. And Canada is not among the largest, but we're still a significant coal producer, 13th in the world, mostly from British Columbia to export to Asia, but also in Alberta we have coal production. And then we move to crude oil, which is of course a very significant source of energy in the world and in Canada. And then here you see Canada that having a relatively large share, and we are actually the 4th largest energy oil producer in the world, behind Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the US that you see here, actually almost in order, the United States being the largest oil producer in the world. Then comes natural gas with the US and Russia being the largest energy producers, but Canada being again a 4th. And we look at Canada and Iran, we are actually, we have very similar energy profiles with Iran, but Canada, of course, being in the shadow of the US and extremely connected with the US, has a much lower preeminence in the world energy stage. So we are a much smaller energy player, despite the fact that we are among the largest energy producers and oil and gas producers in the world. Then comes the non-carbon energy sources, nuclear power. Then we see Canada has a little bit of it, but you see the US leading, Russia and China having also significant amount of nuclear power. Hydro comes next with, of course, extremely limited amount of hydropower that we see. China is leading the world in hydropower, and then so that you see the green at the top of the China bar there. But Canada has significant amount of hydro. Then geothermal is almost invisible in this global graph. Solar and wind is almost invisible, but if we go back, look at China and the US, there are still some amounts that can be visible there. It's growing, of course, faster in the last, it's been growing faster in the last 10 years. And then we have biofuels, especially biomass, which makes the bulk of the biofuel production across the world. And you see India here, which become, is part of the 10 largest energy producer because of biofuels and biomass to meet the needs of many of the Indian people. So here we have the picture of the 10 largest energy producers in the world, and Canada is the 6th largest, but in terms of oil and gas, we are closer to the 4th level. Now, we can claim #1 position in terms of production per capita, not exactly #1 production per capita, but when we look at the same 10 countries, the same 10 largest energy producers in the world, per capita, we're not first, but we are third behind Saudi Arabia and Australia. Which makes of Canada a very big energy producer per capita, but where we can claim #1 position, and then I'm not sure I should be proud of that as a Canadian, is in terms of total primary energy supply per capita and total final consumption per capita, where Canada is clearly leading the world in total final energy consumption per capita. When the world energy consumption per capita is averaging 54 gigajoule per year, we are at 224, which is quite a large number for energy production consumption. And here you can see, if we look we compare Canada to other countries, we see production is largely above total primary energy supply and consumption, which means that, of course, the difference between the blue bar and the orange bar is what a country exports or import. And we see Saudi Arabia, Canada, and Australia have blue bars largely above their primary energy supply. Same thing as for Russia, meaning that these countries are exporters of energy. And if you look at China and the US, the blue bar is below the orange bar, which means they are net importer per capita. And that is an element that, of course, is shaping the geopolitics of energy, and is very important to remember that Canada, as being an exporter of energy and mostly oil, gas to the US, that shapes the energy sector in Canada. Now, if we look more at the total final consumption per capita, where Canada is leading the world, we're actually leading among the 10 largest energy producers. We're not leading totally if we look at all countries in the world, but if we look at countries with more than 5 million people, meaning most of the countries we like us to be compared to, we are leading, except for the United Arab Emirates, which has a higher energy consumption per capita than Canada. And here you see a breakdown per different sectors. So the blue sector at the bottom is the industrial sector consumption per capita. Then the orange bar is the transportation sector per capita. And you see in Canada and the US, we have extremely large orange bars. The transportation sector is much greater than, for example, Finland, that is just besides the US in terms of energy consumption per capita. But in Finland, it's really the industry that is driving the energy consumption rather than transportation, as in the US or Canada, where transportation is per capita the highest source of energy consumption. So you see, and of course, if we can compare these countries to the world is at around 54 gigajoule of energy consumption per capita. Canada is 4 times that level at 224. We have a very important energy consumption per capita, even when we compare our energy consumption to countries comparable to Canada, the US, Finland, Norway, or other European countries. So that means that we are significant not only as an energy producer, but as an energy consumer. Canada is extremely important, and that's probably something that, well, we should not be proud of, and where there's a huge area of improvement. So if we go to the oil sector, which is probably the dominant energy sector in Canada, it's important to realize that most of the oil production in Canada, which was about 4.6 million barrels per day in 2018, most of it, 4/5, is in Alberta. And then you have some other countries, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and Labrador, with significant production for Canadian scale, but still much lower than in Alberta. And more than 50% of this oil production is made by 5 important oil production companies, which are all privately owned and publicly traded. So that's also very important when we compare oil production in Canada compared to the world, where many state-owned companies play an important role in oil production. Like in the US, oil production in Canada is dominated by private companies. There are actually no government-owned companies involved in the oil production sector. So that makes it very difficult for government to mandate companies to restrict production, as we've seen in OPEC countries, where governments negotiate and can mandate their companies to reduce production. In Canada and in the US, it's not directly feasible to have the government mandating reductions in oil production. Now, the big story that happened in Canada in oil production is really told by this graph, where you see oil and gas production in Alberta, the monthly production 2007 to 2020. To now, actually, and you see conventional oil production being flat at around 500,000 barrels per day. Natural gas declining from 2007 to 2012, but then stabilizing, and we have a stable natural gas production in Alberta, despite the low natural gas prices that we've seen in North America after 2008, where natural gas prices collapsed. But what's dominating the oil story is really the steady growth of oil sands production, non-conventional oil produced by oil sands from oil sand resources, from 1 million barrels a day in 2007 to more than 3 million barrels per day now. And that has really changed the dynamics of oil production, and that really made of Canada and Alberta a key player in world energy production, despite the fact that it's usually not known that Canada is such a big oil producer in terms of amounts of oil producer. Again, that made Canada the fourth largest oil producer in the world. And now to understand the Canadian context of this oil production, in this graph, the bubbles you see are the size of the energy sector GDP in the 10 Canadian provinces. And of course, you see Alberta with the largest bubble, because it's in Alberta where the energy sector GDP is the largest. And you see there's an outer bubble and an inner bubble. And in 2014, the GDP of the energy sector in Alberta was $110 billion. And that was when the oil prices were at $100 and above per barrel. And then the price collapsed. And in 2016, then the same sector GDP was reduced by more than half at 49 billion. And of course, now in 2020, when oil prices collapsed even further, you can see the size of that bubble you could imagine that the size of the bubble shrunk even more. Now, what's interesting to see in this graph is not only the size of these bubbles, but it's where they stand in the graph. And look at Ontario. Ontario has a relatively small energy sector compared to Alberta, but Ontario is close to 40% of the Canadian GDP, and the energy sector in Ontario is almost 3%, is only 3% of the provincial GDP. So that makes 40% of the Canadian GDP is in Ontario, and Ontario has a relatively small energy sector. If you look at Quebec, Quebec is close to 20% of the Canadian GDP, so more than Alberta, which is about 15%, but with an energy sector that has a share of the provincial GDP at close to 5%. So you see the two largest provinces in Canada, Quebec and Ontario, which account for approximately 60% of the GDP of Canada, have a relatively small energy sector representation within their provincial GDP. So that creates, of course, a very specific dynamics in Canadian energy, because you have some provinces, Alberta dominating with more than 20% of its GDP based on the energy sector. And you see also Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador, the two other smaller energy provinces at the top, where a very significant share of their GDP is energy sector. But they represent only a small share of the Canadian GDP. So that creates an asymmetry in economics priorities for different provinces, because of course Ontario and Quebec will have different views and perspective on the importance of the energy sector, despite the fact that they are well aware that Alberta is an important province and has an important GDP and is going through a major crisis, because you can see this bubble shrinking 2014, 2016, and with the current oil prices for 2020, then the energy sector GDP will probably shrink by another 50% in this year. So that creates a very distinct dynamic into the Canadian energy sector, especially since provinces manage their own energy sector. So Alberta, Quebec, Ontario, and all the other provinces have most of the says in terms of energy policy and how they direct their internal energy sector. Now let's go through these crises in Canada, and unfortunately there are many. The first one is the oil price crisis. It's a double oil price crisis. The first one that we already mentioned is the collapse in the price of oil. So here you see the West Texas intermediate oil prices. They collapsed in 2014. That was the cause of the shrinking of the GDP, energy sector GDP in Alberta by more than 50%, directly related to the fact that oil prices went down by 50%. But the other price crisis that Alberta faces is the fact that Alberta oil producers don't get paid the WTI price, but the WCS price, the Western Canadian Select price, and there's a discount for that price. And that differential that now appears on the screen, that bold line is the discount that Canadian producers face. And you can see, although it's been stable by 2014 until 2018, in 2018, that price differential grew to very significant amounts and went down a little bit last year, but went up again at the end of last year and the beginning of the year. And so that differential really hurts these Canadian producers, these Albertan producers mostly, because of course they have to sell their oil at the discount prices beyond the low prices that we see. And these numbers are even before the recent lower prices that we've seen. And the recent low was achieved in last March 30th, where the WTI price collapsed at $20 per barrel, and the WCS went as low as $4.69 a barrel, which of course makes a situation catastrophic for Alberta oil producers, because they just don't have the resources to sustain their production, and that situation translates at the provincial level in terms of government funding at the provincial level, because the government is not receiving the royalty rates that they used to receive, because they are royalties in Alberta are based on the oil price, and when the oil price is low, then the Alberta government suffers a lot from these prices. Now, the second crisis in Canada is a pipeline crisis. Here you see the network of pipeline across Canada. You see Alberta, most of these pipelines in Canada start from Alberta, which is the center of the oil production. And there is a network of pipeline which is good to bring the oil to the Gulf Coast. That's how the pipeline system has been designed. Originally, there's a pipeline that you can see going towards the West Coast and the Pacific, Vancouver. That current pipeline is really not export driven. It's really for the refineries in BC and Washington State. But why is there a crisis? The crisis comes not from the existing pipelines, where you see the Keystone and Bridge main lines, all the green lines that you see below. That's the pipeline, the existing pipeline capacity that we've just seen on the previous slide. But all the projects that were expected to come online, and these slides come from 2015 projections made by the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. You see there are many projects that were supposed to come online to make sure that the actual growth in production, which is the red line that you see on that graph, has enough pipeline capacity to get out of Alberta. The problem was that this TransCanada Energy East project was cancelled. The Northern Gateway project also canceled. The Trans Mountain expansion was delayed, and that initially should have been online by 2018, and it's far from being completed now, and no one exactly knows when it will be completed. Keystone XL, also a lot of delays, and again, that's a huge share of capacity that was expected way before and isn't there. It's only these two smaller projects that were more expansion or restoration projects that came online and gave a little brief, a little bit of room for producers, which now have to basically get their oil out of Alberta through rail or reduce their production, which they have done in some different periods. But rail is much more expensive than pipelines. You can double or triple the cost of transportation with rail, up to $20 per barrel, when by pipeline it's $4 or $5 per barrel. So you can imagine when you sell your barrel of oil at $4 like now, $4 to $7 now in terms of the Western climates, the Western Canadian Select benchmark, which is between $5 and $10 these days. The transportation cost is actually bigger than the actual product cost, so that hurts really the producers. There's a regulatory crisis. The third crisis that I'll mention is the regulatory crisis. The federal government wanted to change how infrastructure projects were assessed. And there was in last June two new bills, but the first one, the C-69 bill, was a new bill for impact assessment agency to create a new impact assessment agency overseeing infrastructure projects in a more comprehensive way. And of course, this more comprehensive way could slow down the way projects are approved. And that was objected by the industry and the Alberta government. So that was a huge cause of dispute in Canada last year before the October elections. Now we're discussing much less these issues because other crises became more important than that one. But we have to remember that this isn't solved, and there are still a lot of complaints about these regulatory changes that were made, especially the first one, but the second one is also preventing oil tankers to navigate in the northern area above the Vancouver Island in British Columbia, which basically removes a huge share of the coast and creates problems for oil tankers. Now, another crisis that is part of the overall Canadian context is the emission crisis. Here on that graph, you see Canadian emissions, the total emissions, the bold black line at 716 megaton in 2017. They have to go down in 2030, 30% below the 2005 level at 511 megaton. So that's a huge decline, unprecedented decline that Canada has never really experienced in a context where oil and gas production and the transport sector have been growing like no other sectors. So you see the growth in these two sectors and the projection in terms of oil and gas extraction, at least the projections before the COVID-19 crisis, were a steady growth in terms of oil and gas extraction. So that creates, of course, a significant crisis that it's not compatible to keep the same pace of growth for oil and gas and the transportation sector that is, of course, mostly based on petroleum products, with the objective of reducing greenhouse gases. And that creates huge tensions within different groups of the Canadian society, because many provinces like Quebec, even Ontario and British Columbia are committed to these targets. And there's just a conflict between the reality of Canadian emissions and the target, and we have very little time, 10 years, to manage a way to achieve that target, which is the Paris Agreement target. So that's a crisis because we haven't been able to find a solution. Now there are more crises to come, and I know I'm already at 20 minutes past my time, so I'll still take 5 minutes extra, and we'll move on to the question period after. But we already, for most of us, forgot that. But in this year, February and March, for 1 month, most of the rail pathways in Canada were blocked. So rail traffic was blocked in Canada because of this problem with the Wet'suwet'en territory and the fact that the Coastal Link LNG pipeline bringing natural gas from the BC interior to the Kitimat LNG Canada liquefaction plant. So that's a natural gas transmission line that is currently being built and goes through First Nation territories, but with problems, with negotiation problems and First Nation consultation problems. And they've been able, this First Nation and supporting groups, to block all the railways across Canada for close to a month. So that was a big crisis that we forgot because of the COVID-19, and that was partly solved. But we have to remember that that there are other LNG projects, and this project is not completed, and it doesn't go easily with all the stakeholders in the Canadian society. So there are still a lot of negotiations and issues to be solved. We have hydropower crises, which are more localized. We have two main projects, two large projects, hydropower projects in Canada, one in BC, Site C, one in Newfoundland and Labrador, Muskrat Falls, which are relatively big projects, but with extremely large costs. And that's creating a lot of issues, especially in Newfoundland and Labrador, where you have 800 megawatt project with more than 11 billion cost, a project that is not yet completed, with no buyers for all these 5 terawatt hour of energy. The part of that 5 terawatt hour is already sold to Nova Scotia, but part of it is not sold. So for that province, Newfoundland and Labrador, that creates a huge financial burden at a time where their oil and gas production has a value which is at a fraction at what they thought it would be when oil prices were high. So remember, Newfoundland and Labrador, they're also a significant energy producer an oil producer in Canada, and they now suffer from oil production that has much lower value and a hydro project that went over cost. In terms of transmission lines, and I'm getting close, that's the last crisis I want to share with you. And that's more a Quebec crisis, but it could become a regional crisis if that transmission line isn't being built. It's a transmission line that is supposed to bring close to 10 terawatt hour of energy per year from Quebec to Boston that you see, but there's no transmission line at this point. The contract was signed in 2018, but of course it's pending a transmission line. The northern pass that you see going through New Hampshire was not approved by New Hampshire. So now the project is the one going through Maine, the Clean Energy Connect project that you see, the white line going through Maine, and then already existing internal transmission capacity would bring the electricity from Maine to Boston. But that's a significant contract for Hydro-Quebec and for Massachusetts, but there's no transmission line that is possible. And although it's not a crisis as visible as the ones that I've just mentioned before, it's one that could be problematic for the long-term clean energy supply of New England. And similar situation happens with New York, trying to improve its renewable energy supply, but not having enough capacity. And there's the Champlain-Hudson Power Express transmission line is already approved and could be used, but then there's a financing. There are many financial details to be concluded before it can actually be built. So these are all the crises that were existing before the COVID-19. The COVID-19, of course, is creating a catastrophic situation in Alberta and to a lower extent in the two other provinces which have a smaller energy oil production. But that catastrophic situation that was already catastrophic in Alberta and Saskatchewan before the COVID-19 is made even worse with the price of oil going down to the level that we have. And of course, that crisis cannot be felt the same way in Ontario and Quebec as I've shown you, because in Quebec and Ontario, which are bigger provinces, the energy sector does not have the same importance. So we don't have the same sensitivity, even though we are compassionate. You know, the economic reality in Ontario and Quebec is not the same as in Alberta. So that creates, again, an asymmetry in how things are felt. There's the economic slowdown that comes with the COVID-19 will have impacts on all the investment that we see in the energy sector, oil and gas, LNG, but also in hydro and other renewable. With low energy prices, it will be hard to invest in renewable electricity production when natural gas prices are extremely low. We've seen that for some periods. That, you know, that kills that lowers a lot the electricity prices and makes hydro and wind much less profitable in such a context, and that could continue for some time. Maybe from the greenhouse gas perspective, the forced reduction are positive, you know, from an environmental perspective. We have to say that, but you know, the real trick will be to how to make sure that these reductions are sustained over the longer run, and that's a key challenge, especially if we want to restart the economy the way, well, in a clever way. So that will be a very difficult task in the future. So the key question will be how to help the energy sectors, and now I've put energy sectors in a plural form because there are many of these sectors. The oil and gas sector is suffering the most, but all energy sector will have to be taken into account because Canada, as I mentioned, has climate goals that we need to achieve, and an energy sector that we need to help. And so we need to find ways, creative ways to help the energy sector. So just a few words on possible sustainable paths. Let me say that first, there won't be any easy solution. So all ideas could be shared, but no idea will be easy. Nothing will be easy. There will have to be some consolidation in the oil and gas industry to prepare for possible steady or declining production. Given the new world reality in terms of oil prices, Canada has to be prepared for a steady or declining oil production, because that constant growth that we've been experiencing during the last 15 years in terms of oil production is not sustainable with the current oil prices. So that's probably the first lesson we need to prepare for. Then we need to seek fundamental changes in consumption levels, because we do have in Canada, as I documented before, extremely high level of energy consumptions, which are mostly explained by low prices in Canada, abundance of energy, low taxes. Of course, we are a big country and it's a cold country, so we need energy to move across Canada and to heat our buildings. But this is not what is driving really the energy consumption in Canada. It's really the low prices and our culture of energy consumption that is certainly not the most efficient one across the world. So if we want to be leaders in terms of energy sector, we need to show the world that we can do our homeworks and actually reduce our energy consumption. Now, the third point is to develop a sustainable fiscal framework. I already mentioned oil and gas consumption was driven by low taxes in Canada, low consumption taxes, and in some cases, no fuel taxes, especially in some provinces like Alberta. There's no sales tax, low fuel taxes. We need to have higher carbon prices to send a price signal. That can be hard for in a period of crisis, but we need to prepare for the long run. We haven't been able to have high carbon prices when oil prices were high. We need to find the right time, and maybe now is the right time because oil consumption is at a low level, and we should be prepared to sustain that low level and to finance and bring some fiscal responsibility into the energy sector. And then the last point is really an electricity point. For deep decarbonization that Canada is seeking, we need to or reopen our, well, not reopen, we need to open our provincial energy sectors to be able to integrate our electricity sectors across provinces so that the hydro BC is producing can really help wind in Alberta to be balanced. And so the balancing between hydro and wind would be will be done in a much easier way if you can better integrate and manage these systems. So there are integration benefits between Alberta and BC, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, Manitoba and Ontario, Quebec and Ontario, Quebec and the Maritimes provinces, Quebec and the US. There's a lot of balancing that could be done with the hydropower in Canada. That's a huge opportunity Canada has. And for that to basically capture that opportunity, we need to integrate our electricity systems in a much clever way. So on that, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to point you to go to the IAEE.org website. The IAEE is really an organization that is close to my heart and makes has a lot of interesting publications and conferences when we can have conferences on energy economics. So so please go to the IAEE website, visit our website, energy.hec.ca. I'd like to thank my sponsors, the sponsors of my chair. And now we can open the Q&A period, and I'll be happy to read the questions with you and go over them. If I can just go back to my full screen. And maybe I'll stop sharing my screen. Sorry for that. Okay, I see the Q&A here. Okay, so there's been a lot of questions. So there are 16 questions. The first one, why do we consume more energy in Canada than in the US per capita? That's really our industrial sector that is driving our energy consumption. We have a lot of industries in Canada that are energy intensive, in Alberta, for example, but also in Quebec. We have a lot of aluminum companies, pulp and paper companies, and that drives the industrial energy consumption. One question is, why do Canadian companies produce at such a low price? Well, it's very hard to stop producing oil, especially with oil sands, where you have to bring in situ mining, which is the dominating source of oil sands. In situ, you have to inject heat in the ground and basically heat the sand that is like probably 500 meters below the ground. You have to heat that sector with steam. And if you stop production, basically it's hard to restart your process, your heating process. So the shutdown costs being high, a little bit like nuclear power, shutdown costs are high, they need to produce. And that's part of the answer. How can we build a pan-Canadian integrated energy system that comprises our environmental and societal and economic growth? Okay, so that's a very big question. A pan-Canadian integrated energy system, that's the dream of some of us. We have to say that in terms of oil and gas, it's already quite well integrated in terms of the physical infrastructure and the flow of oil and gas. It's really the electricity sector that isn't well integrated with 10 different electricity systems and design and market designs. So the electricity system is all over the place. It's really a problem in terms of electricity integration. We need a lot more collaboration and discussions between provinces, and consumers would have to also understand that it's okay to, if it's okay to import oil, it's okay to import natural gas. So consumers would have to understand that it's okay also to import electricity, which isn't felt the same way in many cases. There's a lot of protectionism in the electricity sector. People feel that they need to have their electricity supply close to their home, which is fair, but we import oil and gas, so why can't we import electricity in the same kind of amounts? That's something that has to evolve to make people understand that it's fine to import and export electricity as it is fine to export oil and gas. On the ongoing opposition between oil and gas pipelines, so yes, and so that's there is ongoing opposition in oil and gas, and in terms of high voltage transmission lines, power lines, in Germany there is opposition to transmission lines, and I've mentioned that in my as a crisis too in Canada and the US. There is opposition towards transmission lines, so that will make our transition towards a cleaner economy and a decarbonized economy much more difficult, because people will also oppose transmission lines as they oppose now in they've been opposing in New Hampshire and in Maine. There are some groups that are opposing transmission lines. And then there are trade-offs. People will have to understand that we cannot have it all. We need to have transmission lines, we need to have pipelines, we need to have some disruptions in our daily lives in order to have these energy systems. Especially if we want to decarbonize, we will need more transmission lines, we will need more wind farms, and these wind farms will be opposed by some groups because they may not like their look, or they may have some other arguments. So I'll try to move to the different questions. I'll take the more recent one. I've started with the first one. I'll go to the last one now. Is Canada at risk of having fossil fuel stranded assets having to be written off due to climate priorities in the longer term? And yes, that's definitely a risk, that we've been investing in these stranded, in many infrastructure that may be stranded because of the new energy reality. So that's an issue that we need to be taking into account. Investors have to be taking into account, and to some extent, they've already integrated that aspect. If we look at Tech Resources that had a very large oil project in Alberta, then they just canceled their project, probably because of the oil prices. I've been reminded that this webinar is recorded, so you will have a chance to have another look at the slides, and to share the webinars if you liked it. I will continue with some questions. I understand if some of you need to leave, then that's of course totally acceptable. I'll try to go to some other questions. So let me. Okay, I have questions on methane regulation in Canada and how the COVID-19 crisis can affect that methane regulation. It will be hard in the context, it will be hard for the government to implement a lot of more stringent regulation in the context. Now, I think the oil and gas industry will need some help, but we'll need to find clever ways to help the oil and gas industry without changing regulation, and without loosening regulation that is critical if we want to have, in the long run, a sustainable industry. The industry has to be effective with methane emissions, so there has to be a strict monitoring of methane emission for its own credibility in terms of climate impact. Methane emissions have to be controlled. It is a priority. If we want to reconcile greenhouse gas emission targets with an oil and gas industry, the oil and gas industry has to show that they have the cleanest oil and gas industry possible in the world. And by having strict methane emissions regulation in Canada, that will help the oil and gas industry establish itself as an acceptable and legitimate sector in the long run, at least for the 20 years or 30 years in which we will need to have oil and gas. So I think the case could be made that stronger regulation is actually helpful for the industry to be accepted as an industry in our sector. Do I agree that that some of the anti-oil movements in Canada is being financed or funded by foreign interest? That could be the case. So, I've never looked in details into these issues. There's money coming from different sources. I think there's a lot of groups in Canada that oppose these projects. There's a lot of resistance. It's not easy to sell a pipeline, especially in provinces like Quebec or Ontario, we don't produce oil, so we don't see these pipelines. They're not key for our economy as much as they are for the Alberta economies. I showed in Alberta or Saskatchewan, the share of the energy sector being much higher. There's a sensitivity that is different. But in other provinces, that sensitivity is not there, and I think there's enough of Canadians that are that oppose oil and gas that I don't think the international funds for the anti-oil movement are significant. I think there's a lot of Canadian opposition that is coming from Canadians. How do I suggest Canadians to be engaged and educated to understand the significance of the issue to the economic future of our country? Well, that's a hard question. You know, energy literacy has been low, and people have, for years. I think we're not helping our case with the low prices that we benefit from, because we benefit from low prices, but we're not helping our case because when it's cheap, then we basically buy a lot and don't consider alternatives. And we don't look into the details of it. So I'm a big advocate of higher prices, because that, I think it's a way of making people understand that it's important. Energy literacy would rise, but of course we need to have these kind of webinars. We have to explain to people, we have to educate the importance of oil, natural gas, electricity, renewable sources, and we need to tell Canadians that they are the largest energy consumers in the world, to let them understand that there are such a big room for improvements in Canada that we could do a lot in terms of climate goals and actual economic savings, financial gains, by just being more clever about how we use energy. Let me look at other questions. We have a lot of questions. Thank you. 54 questions so far. I won't be able to go through all of them, but I'm just taking them kind of randomly. What are the perspectives in terms of future project development, such as the LNG plant in Quebec? There's a LNG project in Quebec in the Saguenay River, taking again natural gas from Alberta, and we would need to construct a new natural gas pipeline from Ontario to the new LNG plant. I think that the perspective for these LNG projects in Quebec are not very good, not due to the COVID-19. The COVID-19 doesn't help in any case, but I think the economics was questioned before, and mostly because of international prices. The demand for LNG will be there. It's hard to predict. You know, there's been so many LNG projects that have fallen across the world, so it's always very difficult. But the current economic situation doesn't help with a lot of investments that may be more priority in other places. And also, if climate goals are loosened in some cases, then basically maybe the demand for LNG won't be as large as if the climate targets were as stringent as some people would expect. There's another question on the pan-Canadian electricity integration being possibly impossible because of technical issues transporting electricity over long distance. So that's an interesting question, and people often think that because we're a large country, it's difficult to transport energy. In Quebec, most of the electricity production is in the north, more than 1,000 kilometers north of Montreal. So we already face this long distance, and that problem has been mostly solved during the 70s and 80s with the construction of high voltage DC lines. So basically, currently, Montreal is supplied with electricity that is coming from further than it would go if it was going to Boston. So, we do have direct current high voltage lines that are built and could be built to solve the issues of power losses across long distance. So that's not a key issue. To integrate different provinces, that's already being built and considered in many cases. Are the eastern refineries processing Western Canadian crude oil? So the answer is yes and no, depending on how far you go east. Montreal Quebec has two refineries, one in Montreal and one in near Quebec City. And these refineries, yes, are refining Canadian oil and US oil. So 100% now of the oil refined in Quebec refineries are North American, and mostly 50% Canadian, 50% US. And then you have the really eastern refineries, the largest one being in New Brunswick, the Irving refinery, that is refining Saudi Arabian oil, some, of course, North American oil, but is not fully supplied with Canadian oil. So there are imports from abroad and Saudi Arabia in the Irving refinery in New Brunswick. Do I think it is possible for Canada to achieve a carbon neutral energy system by 2050? Yes, without any doubt, I think it is feasible, technically feasible, but there are huge obstacles to achieve that goal. And the obstacles are the social inertia we have in our energy systems. It is very hard to change our habits. People love their SUVs. They love, if we look at the transportation system in Canada, it's been growing in terms of SUVs and in terms of the number of cars and vehicles in the fleet. So basically, it's hard to change how people transport themselves. It's hard to change the building code to have carbon passive houses. Basically, we need to move towards passive buildings by 2050 if we want to achieve that. It is technically and financially, it is feasible. You know, we have 30 years to bring our stock of buildings towards, you know, maybe not totally passive buildings, but very energy efficient buildings, 80% reduction in energy consumption in every building within 30 years. There's no doubt that it is technically feasible. Now, regulation, the construction sector, the renovation sector, they have to evolve to make that possible. And that, it is very difficult. Technically, yes. Economically, I think it would actually be beneficial for the Canadian economy to be carbon neutral by 2050. But it's really our institutions, our inertia in the social system that are the main problems. What about the idea of having a Canadian energy policy? So if you talk to Natural Resources Canada, they would say, well, we do have a Canadian energy policy. Our energy policy, the Canadian energy policy, is to let provinces do their own energy policy. And then we have 10 different energy policies. But then, so the question is rather how to have a fully Canadian and harmonized energy policy. That's a big question. Provinces would have to bring that priority to a higher level, and politicians would have to be visionary politicians, because within 4 years, no politician wants to have this fight in the agenda, the 4-year horizon they have. So they would need to be visionary to think about 2050. And the problem is, a Canadian energy policy would be worth for 2030, 2050, but that's beyond the political agenda and horizon of current politicians. So we need some visionary politicians, and we need a population that does understand that the energy system has to evolve, and that's hard to change. It's through education. Another question: do I think the crisis will boost renewable energy investment in order to break our addiction to fossil fuel? Well, no, I don't think the crisis will boost renewable energy investments. I think the crisis may let us understand that we don't have to use as much fossil fuel, especially oil, in our energy system. I think transportation systems can learn a lot from the crisis. We discovered the benefits of working from distance, having these kind of webinars. Lots of meetings will be taking place online because of pure savings. Even if we could travel, some people will decide, well, it's been working well without traveling, so let's save the travel cost and the energy cost of these travels. And I think we can learn a lot. I'm not saying we should not travel. We will continue to travel, but there will be a reduction in the needs for travel, and that's good. That's good for the sanity of the energy system. Okay, let me check some other question, and I'll stop at noon. So we'll continue for until noon. So we continue for 7 minutes. There's a question here. If energy consumption is linked to wealth or GDP per capita, and there are two ways to reduce consumption, either higher efficiency or lower consumption, what is a good model for GDP per capita? When do we become too rich when it comes to energy use? Well, you know, I don't question the historical link between GDP per capita and energy use, but I do question the recent link in energy per capita. We've seen across the world a decline in energy intensity, and that's because we are becoming richer and richer without using more energy in proportion to the wealth we generate. So I think we can decouple GDP per capita and wealth creation. We have decoupled it to some extent, and that will continue, I think. So I think our wealth can be used to reduce energy consumption through energy efficiency, and that is what we should do. And we can continue to generate wealth in sectors that don't use energy, like the education sector, the entertainment sector. There are so many sectors that can still grow without huge energy consumption, with sustainable energy consumption, so that I don't think it will become a huge problem. Is the worst still to come for the oil sector in Canada when inventories are full, expected in May? Will Alberta oil fields see a more significant shutdown associated to the high cost of stop and restarting? So I think yes, unfortunately, if the crisis continue, and it looks like that it will continue for some weeks and months, the worst is yet to come, because demand will not rebound quickly, and production hasn't been reduced. Internationally and nationally, the oil production wasn't reduced in the same proportion as demand. So yes, when inventories will be full, we'll see another collapse in oil prices. And I think the real crisis for oil producers is yet to come. As bad as it's been so far, we might see a further decline in oil prices due to these inventories that are full. So it will become a problem. Do I agree that global energy demand will continue to rise? Do you think completion of oil projects could improve the return for Canada? So global energy demand, yes, should rise again after we are through this economic crisis. So that's the economic recession that is currently happening and will continue for some time will of course will decrease demand, and that will be a problem. Now, energy demand will eventually catch up. If societies are clever, they will find transportation systems that are not as energy intensive as they are. But pipelines, so to come to pipeline, which is the second part of the question, pipelines will help Canadian producers. So I think there's still the case for pipeline, and for recently we've heard Keystone XL to go forward. We've heard that it was going forward. Still, the case for pipelines can be made, because even with the current level of production of oil, the Alberta producers need more options to sell their oils in different markets. So eventually, these pipelines will be useful for oil producers. So the current projects that are being built or considered, I think they still have a sense in the Canadian framework. Because for the next 20 years, we'll need oil. There will be oil in needs in different parts of the world. Maybe not as much as we used to think, but we'll need that. So there's a lot of uncertainty about the aggressiveness of carbon policies, and how quickly the economy will recover. But current oil pipelines, I think, can make their case, and they will face less opposition if there is a strong climate policy that is implemented mostly on the consumption side, because most of our gains, we can make them on the consumption side. And I think that's how we can reconcile the energy production sector in Canada with the climate reality that we need to face, is first to start with consumption. We're the biggest energy consumers in the world. There's a lot of room for progress and energy efficiency, and we'll make these, we can reconcile. That's where I have hope. Without saying that it's easy, I have hope there. The graph on energy consumption per capita, Singapore has the highest energy consumption in the non-energy use. Why? And I believe, I'm not an expert on Singapore, but I believe Singapore has a lot of sorry, I'm looking for the word, but it's basically industrial energy use. Petrochemical industry is very strong in Singapore. So they have refineries and petrochemical industries that need different molecules as a feedstock for their production. So that's why they use energy, and they use the molecule for the petrochemical industry, and they use the energy, but it's a non-energy use because they don't burn the energy, they just use the molecules for other sectors. So that's why. Okay, I'll take a last question, which is the last question being asked, the most recent one. Is the current collaborative dynamics between producing provinces like Alberta and the federal government to protect producers sustainably beyond the current crisis? Well, that's a hard question. You know, producers in Canada, oil producers, have grown probably in a non-sustainable way, and the current situation, world price situation in Canada is probably not in Canada, but the world price situation is probably a reflection of the fact that that wasn't sustainable. A lot of growth happened due to an inflated oil prices and a deflated fiscal framework. So I'm not sure we should save all the oil industry in its current form, in the past form, because there is a consolidation cycle to go through to make sure that only the sustainable producers could continue their operations in the future. And as in any crisis, the weakest one will probably have to go. And that's probably good for everyone, because we cannot maintain overproduction forever, especially if they are less profitable producers. They should not, we should not try to save everyone, as hard as it sounds. And I don't want to be critical about anyone, but as in any crisis, we'll have to make choices. So the current government should not try to save everyone. Only the strongest should be saved so that they can keep their core production. But over the long run, it's really hard to think that there can be sustainable growth of oil production in Alberta, continued growth, given the oil prices, the cycles we go through, the cost of extraction in Alberta, and the climate reality. So I'm not saying we should shut down the oil production in Alberta, definitely not, but the current growth model of Alberta has to change. So on that, I will thank you again for attending this webinar. There's been a lot of questions. I thank you for all these questions. The webinar has been recorded. It will be available on the IAE website. Slides of the webinars, many people ask for the slides, will be also shared on the IAE website and on my chair website. Again, thank you very much for joining, and I wish you a good day. Bye-bye.